Hey, yo, welcome back to another episode of the Yak Fishing Podcast. Today we're talking about everything and knots. This is basic techniques. This is ins and outs about why they fail, what they actually do, how they work. And if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you actually can see some live tying as well to teach you how to tie some of these more popular knots. And at the very end, we're going to talk about what I consider to be the best knot for a beginner, and I will explain all that as we go. So, hope everybody's doing great today. My name is Anthony. If you're new to the Yak Fishing Podcast, we are doing a beginner series called Anyone Can Fish. We're going over the basics of fishing, based from tackle, based on technique, going into some more advanced stuff like how to find fish, studying fish behavior, and getting you all set to be able to get out there and catch some fish. So let's get into it. Before we get too far into it, let me ask you guys a question. Have you ever been out there and you've been fishing, and then all of a sudden you have a line break or have this break off a snag, and you reel your line in and you have something that looks like this, something that's all twisted and frayed? Well, there are a couple reasons that can happen. We'll be going over that as well, and how you can prevent that and make it so it doesn't happen as often. So, anyone can fish, knots for beginners. Well, what is a fishing knot? Well, it is a connection between a line and either a lure, another piece of line, uh, a swivel, some sort of terminal tackle, or a sinker. Uh, any kind of connection involving looping the line over itself is called a knot. But before we get too far into this, I want to preface that there is no such thing as a perfect knot. No knot works 100% of the time in all situations, and no knot has 100% strength. What do you mean by that? Well, if you're using 20-pound line, for instance, and you tie a knot on it, that means that knot will break before the 20-pound mark. You will never get 100% of the strength of the line that you're using when it comes to a knot. It's completely against its nature. The reason that's the case is because a knot puts pressure on itself. Now, another thing I will say is not all knots are created equal. It's completely based on line type. The three. If you watched the other episodes of this, we've talked about in the past line types. You have braid, fluorocarbon, and monofilament as the main three in existence out there that anglers have access to. There are certain knots that work with braid. That will most knots that work with braid will work with anything else. However, a lot of the knots that work with monofilament and fluorocarbon will not work with braid, simply because the amount of friction it takes to keep a knot from slipping with braid is significantly different than with monofilament or fluorocarbon. Another thing about knots created equal, we said that there's not one knot that'll work 100% of the time for all situations. Certain knots work better for connecting lines to lines. Certain knots work better for connecting lures to lines. There's certain scenarios where if you're trying to imitate having uh, a swivel eye on a hook to be able to give it more erratic action while you're reeling it in or something like that, you can imitate that with things such as a loop knot, stuff like that. I mean, they all do different things. They all have different designs. The reason that they were brought up in the first place for these connections and where these different knots came to be was because people were wanting to do different things in certain applications or have more strength in terms of a knot breaking or failing. The other thing is user preference is different. The best knot is the one that you can tie correctly. I don't care who named it, who made it, how many people use it. If you can't tie it correctly, that knot will always fail. Even if you're using something as simple as a square knot, which obviously by the end of this video, I hope to give you some more knots than that, uh, that are one or easier to tie, but two, I'm sorry, won't necessarily be as easy to tie, but they'll work better and they'll have a higher breaking strength and give you more utility in terms of how well they do based on the techniques that you use. So, with that being the case, how do knots work? A knot uses friction and tension to spread the load of force across the line. You have the fish pulling on one end, you're pulling on the other end, or in the case of breaking off a snag, you have the solid object that's not moving versus you. You're trying to force the knot to fail or to break whatever you're stuck to free so you can bring it in. The knot, the way it is made, the loops, the coils, all that stuff, spread that load across the line in order to try to avoid uh, two things. And those two things are why most knots fail, and that is heat or kinks or pinch points. Every time you see a kink or a pinch point on a piece of line, that is more than likely where it's going to fail. The other issue with doing knots, like I said, every time you tie a knot, you weaken the line. The reason that happens is because of heat that is caused by friction. There is no way to 100% eliminate the friction. There's no way to 100% eliminate the heating up of that line. It may not be noticeable to the touch, but it is happening. It's simple science. It's just the way that works when it comes to friction. One of the best ways to eliminate as much as heat as possible is to use lubrication, whether it be sticking the line in the water, whether it be using your saliva to uh, apply it to the knot so it actually has a little bit of more slip till it sets in. One of the best ways to avoid kinks and pinches is just good technique. But the biggest key to tying bigger knots is practice. Obviously, technique, you learn how to tie the knot, you learn different things, learn which one is the best for the application you're going for. Lubrication is to help eliminate the heat. Technique is to prevent the kinks. But practice, practice, and more practice is what gets you to be better at tying knots. And it doesn't have to be something you just sit there. You can sit there at a desk or at home and just tie the knots over and over and over again. That's honestly probably the best way to do it. But literally, you'll gain more practice as you fish more. Now, I will say if you're trying any of these knots that I present to you today at some point, I would suggest tying them a couple times at home before you go take them out on the lake. Uh, Not necessarily because they're complicated, because the ones I provided are the quote unquote lower or easier end of the spectrum in terms of tying the knots. But I mean, there's tons of knots out there. I mean, Salt Strong did a really good series where they took the knots and they put them against each other. And what they found was they ended up compiling a list of the best leader to mainline connection knots. They did a series where they did literally just the highest strength knots in terms of tying to terminal tackle or lures. Um, so a lot of these knots I'm actually listing, you won't see on some of those lists, not because they're not strong, but simply because over time people have developed stronger knots or knots that work better in certain situations. And these are the ones you're going to hear lots of people talk about, the FG knot, the SC knot, the Bimini twist, the Yucatan knot. Um, just for some examples there. But I mean, the ones I'm covering today are really easy to learn. They're the ones that I personally use the most because, again, in the end, the knot that you can tie the best is going to be the knot that works the best for you. Because if you cannot tie it correctly, or if you put too much tension, kinks in it, or too much heat on it while you're tying it, it will fail. And unfortunately, it does mean that at some point while you're learning this, you will lose a fish or you will lose a lure or anything like that. It's something that gets better over time, the more practice you have with it. But it is something that you do have to practice. So, like I said, I named some of these other knots, the FG knot, the SC knot, all these other various knots. But there's five, it's actually six that I consider to be very beginner friendly that will help you out in terms of catching more fish, getting more casts out, getting more lures back, um, prevent prevent lure and leader loss, all that good stuff. And the biggest thing, obviously, is we don't want to lose fish, right? If you put the effort into putting the bait out there, you put the effort to work in the technique, you find the fish, you location, all that good stuff. You finally get the time on the water, you cast out, you hook into the fish. The worst thing that can happen is you reel it in and it has this on there instead of the fish, right? This is a nightmare. We don't want this. This means that you're not failed or untied or unraveled or the line literally stretched. I'm not gonna be able to break this 50-pound line, but the line stretched, whether it be because of frays in from touching rocks or whatever, generated a ton of heat while it was getting stretched and then snapped. So seeing these little curly tail ends on your line lets you know that you're not failed or that your line failed. One of the two. Both of which are problems. Both are something that we don't want. And again, the goal with today's episode is to help you guys prevent that as much as possible so you are having more success on the water. So popular knots for beginners, you have the improved clinch knot or it's also called the fisherman's knot. Uh, Most anglers that I've met, talked to, or in fact, in my case as well, it is the first knot you learn after the square knot, right? The square knot being the simple one where you just take your line, you form one little loop and you pull it tight. Honestly, it's one of the worst lines in the world in terms of strength. It does work for holding something still for a minute, but it is absolutely the worst line for one for strength. So learning something like the improved clinch knot is automatically a step ahead in the right direction. And like I said, for most anglers, it is the first knot they learn. The second knot is going to be the trilene knot. And to me, this is the easiest improvement. It is basically the clinch knot or the improved clinch knot, except that rather than going through the eye once, you're going through the eye twice, and then using instead of having on the clinch knot, you do the line through, which forms a loop. You twist it 5 or 6 times, then run the tag in through the loop you've made with the eye in it. Right on the trilene knot, you have the second lap through the eye, which causes a double loop at the bottom. You do your 5 twists, then run it through the double loop and tie it. The third knot is going to be it's the smallest knot in terms of knot size, which isn't a concern for some people. But if you're doing something with a fluorocarbon leader chasing after a really spooky fish, and you're using a well concealed hook, then this might be something to consider. But it's also the easiest for braid. The issue with braid, like I said before, is that it tends to slip with regular fishing knots or normal fishing knots that people tie. You cannot do a regular clinch knot with braid; it will slip. A trilene knot will do better than a clinch knot with braid, but it can still slip. The Palomar knot, due to the way it's made, has more contact with the hook eye, therefore more friction, which is why it doesn't slip and it works. The way it is tied is you take the line tip, you go through the eye, give yourself a long tag end, take the end of that tag and put it back through the eye. So now you have a double amount of line on both sides of your hook, right? Or swivel or whatever you're going to use. You'll twist it around and make a loop. And inside that loop is where the object you're trying to tie to needs to be. You take the doubled up loop end you've made, not the main line side, but the other side, run it through this little loop you've made, loop it around the object you're trying to tie it to, and then cinch it all down after you lubricate it. Again, this leaves you the smallest footprint of a knot, and uh, when it comes to braid, is the easiest one to tie to not slip. So the next knot is going to be the loop knot. What this does, what some people like to do, they'll put like a snap swivel or uh, another a split ring basically on their lure or on their hook in order to give the bait a little more action to go side to side or to allow a live bait to flutter more or something like that, especially if you're using something under a float or something where you're fishing a little more vertical. What the loop knot does is it eliminates that swivel, so you still have direct contact between the line and the bait, which increases your sensitivity. It also doesn't have another shiny metal bit that could spook a fish as well. It's quite popular for fishing things such as flukes or top water baits, where you're trying to walk the dog, or even jerk baits, because you still have the strength of doing that, but it does allow that little bit of freedom on a hinge to go side to side. It works really, really well also with fishing jigs under a float, or if you're vertical jigging, because especially if you're using something with a soft plastic on a jig head, because it allows that bait to flutter a little more naturally just based on the pressure of the water pushing against the plastic. Uh, and then last but not least on this five, not including the special knot at the end I'm going to talk about, is the snell knot. The snell knot is the best when it comes to circle hooks. It is also one of the top contenders when it comes to hooks to have an outturned eye, whereas the eye of the hook literally, instead of being straight with the shank, turns away from the hook point or the barb. Those hooks are basically asking to be using a snell knot with, simply because of the way that knot works. The easiest way to do it, if you don't have, this only works in this next description. This regular snell knot only works if you have a piece of leader line that does not attach to your main line already. So before you would tie your leader to your swivel, you would tie this knot, but you take the end of it, run it through the hook eye, loop it around, uh, go through the hook eye, take your tag in, come back up towards the eye behind it, not the side where the main line is, but behind it on the shank. loop it 5 or 6 times, and then pull your main line tight. And what it does is those coils cinches down on that main line and pinches it. So it's actually not actually a knot. It's actually it's called a cinch. Same concept. The idea is that you're putting a amount of friction on your line to prevent a lure or bait from slipping. Uh, it does not work with everything, so it does not work for connecting. You can't snell lines to lines, not with a regular standard snell knot. Um, and you can't do if you have it pulling from two different sides because the way that knot's tied, it'll fail from one direction but not the other. So yeah, if you had it both on the swivel end and on the hook end, one of those would end up pulling free at some point because while you're pulling on one, you're giving the other one slack just because of the way cinches work. So another version of the snell knot is actually a nail knot or a uni knot snell. Uh, we'll go over those in a minute though, because actually the best knot, the one knot for everything, well, sort of, because obviously we've talked about it before. You can't have one knot that works for everything; it is impossible due to all the scenarios. But this one knot does work with all line types, including braid. It just takes a little bit of different, one little extra step to make it work with braid versus monofilament fluorocarbon. It is easy to adjust because another problem with knots is some work better with heavier lines, some work better with thinner lines. Well, this one in particular, literally you can adjust another, again, one adjustment during the steps of tying it to make it work with thicker lines or with thinner lines. And I call it the multi-tool of knots because it literally can work with anything. You can use it with circle hooks, you can use it with J hooks, regular hooks, connecting line to line, connecting swivels to line, all that good stuff. The only thing on the list of things we talked about before that does not work, you cannot use this knot to do the little loop on lures. And one of the things that becomes an issue for somebody who's newer and learning how to tie, especially when you're figuring out different line weights, the diameter of line, the thickness of the line. Obviously, the heavier the weight, the breaking strain, typically the stiffer the line, and they can cause a little bit of issue too. That's where this knot will not necessarily be the best. But that knot is the uni knot. And in my opinion, it is the best knot for beginners. If you learn this one knot, you will pretty much be able to do everything you need to do. To use any kind of bait, any kind of line, any kind of situation. It is definitely going to be something you can consider to use, and it is likely to do you well. Um, and in this knot in particular, the easiest way to describe it, you go through the eye of the hook. I'm sorry, in this case, eye of anything, swivel, whatever. You double it back over your main line. You then make a loop on your main line. Take your tag end, go through that loop a number of times, cinch it down after you lubricate it. Lubricate the section between the object and that knot, and then slide the knot down to the object. This allows you to have several coils of pressure against your bait. Uh, and it very easily can be adjusted for different scenarios. If you're fishing with braid, again, like we talked about before, you just go through the line eye twice. But in this case, rather than having the loop at the bottom that you go through, you would just go through the eye, pull it tight, go through the eye again, pull it tight, and then make your loop, do your wraps, and then tighten it down that way. So that way you have a double layer at your hook eye. And you can do this as many times as you want. Salt Strong did another test with the uni knot where they went through the eye 3 times. And what they ended up saying at that point, even though, yes, it did increase the strength when it cinched correctly, that they were really having a lot of issues with it cinching because you have so much friction trying to pull those tight coils around the eye. But the other thing they said was when you're doing your wraps, the more wraps you do, the stronger it's going to be. But back to what I was saying before, when you're using these bigger and thicker lines, you're going to have issues with the line being stiff and it getting in your way. So taking the line and doing less wraps with thicker line gives you the same rough poundage of strength for it to break versus more wraps on lighter line, which that makes sense. You're using thicker line, it's going to have a higher breaking strain to start with. So as a general rule of thumb in my practice, If I'm using something that's heavier than 25 or 30 pounds, then I'm only going to do 5 wraps on the loop on top on the main line. If I'm using smaller line, I'm going to go 6, 7, or 8, depending on how light a line I'm going. I don't do more than 8. 8 seems to be kind of the point where no matter what line you're using, it gets cumbersome. But again, if I'm really concerned with that knot failing, especially using lighter line or using braid, then I'm just going to go through the eye twice rather than just once. But again, as I was saying, the uni knot is my favorite beginner fishing knot because it is able to be used for so many things. As you saw, it can be used for the line to line connection. It can be used for doing a uni knot snell. It can be used for just putting regular terminal tackle or sinkers or baits onto your line. Again, as I said in the beginning, though, it's not the perfect knot. You cannot use it to do loop knots, and in certain applications, because of how cumbersome it is to tie, there might be something that's better to tie. Like in this particular case, if I was wanting to do what I was doing right here, I probably would have better off doing a trilene knot rather than a uni because of how thick this line is. Just because it's easier to tie. Um, but most people aren't going to go out there and be using 50-pound line all the time, so keep that in mind. But we went over some other knots. Obviously, the easiest knot that most people learn to start with was the improved clinch knot. The easiest variation on the improved clinch knot to make it stronger is the trilene knot, where you go through twice and then go through both loops rather than just the one. Loop knot, again, if you're using any kind of bait where you're trying to do any kind of walk in the dog type style stuff, or if you're using any kind of jig under a float or any kind of vertical presentation, it'll allow the bait to look more natural because it will want to hover a little bit different this way because the knot, rather than the knot putting pressure on the bait and having the bait sit diagonal, that loop and that water pressure will let it do this and be more horizontal and the water more natural looking. Then, like I said, the snell knot, if you're doing the original snell cinch, is actually a cinch, not a knot. You cannot have the other end of the line tied to your rod. It has to be a completely separate leader piece. You have to put the hook on first. If you're doing the uni knot snell or what I call the bass fisherman snell, both of those could be done while the bait is attached to the rod. Um, yeah. So hope this helps you guys. Hope that after watching this, it gives you some more knot ideas, maybe a direction to go other than a square knot. I hope that it improves your catch rate in terms of catching bigger fish. Hope you don't lose that big one. Hope that if you are getting snagged on gear, this helps you get some more of your gear back. And if you got any questions, feel free to reach out, leave a comment below, send me an email, all that good stuff. Again, my name is Anthony. You're watching the Yak Fishing Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you guys next week.